Part 1. Exploration. Chapter 1. Closing an Age. 1891. June 14th, 7:51. New Occident began its experiment with elected representation full of hope and optimism, but soon it was tainted by corruption and violence, and it became clear that the system had failed. In 1823, a wealthy representative from Boston suggested a radical plan. He proposed that a single parliament govern New Occident, and that any person who wished to voice an opinion before it should pay admittance. The plan was hailed, by those who could afford it, as the most democratizing initiative since Revolution. They had laid the groundwork for the contemporary practice of selling Parliament time by the second, from Shadrach Ely's History of New Occident. The day New Occident closed its borders, the hottest day of the year, was also the day Sophia Timms changed her life forever by losing track of time. She had begun the day by keeping a close eye on the hour. In the Boston State House, the grand golden clock with its 20 hours hung ponderously over the speaker's dais. By the time the clock struck 8, the State House was full to capacity. Arranged in a horseshoe around the dais sat members of Parliament. The 88 men and 2 women rich enough to procure their positions. Facing them sat the visitors who had paid for time to address the Parliament, and further back were the members of the public who could afford ground floor seating. In the cheap seats in the upper balcony, Sophia was surrounded by men and women who had crammed themselves into the benches. The sun poured in through the tall State House windows, shining off the gilt of the curved balcony rails.
Brutal, isn't it?
The woman beside Sophia sighed, fanning herself with her periwinkle bonnet. There were beads of sweat on her upper lip, and her poplin dress was wilted and damp.
I would bet it's 5 degrees cooler on the ground floor.
Sophia smiled at her nervously, shuffling her boots against the wooden floorboards.
My uncle is down there. He is going to speak. He is now? Where?
The woman put her pudgy hand on the rail and peered down. Sophia pointed out the brown-haired man who sat, straight-backed, his arm folded across his chest. He wore a linen suit and balanced a slim leather book on his knee. His dark eyes calmly assessed the crowded hall. His friend, Miles Countryman, the wealthy explorer, sat next to him, red from the heat, his shock of white hair limp with sweat. Miles wiped a handkerchief briskly across his face.
He is right there, in the front row of speakers. Where?
The woman asked, squinting.
Ah, look, the famous Shadrach Ely is here, I see.
Sophia smiled proudly.
That's him. Shadrach is my uncle.
The woman looked at her in surprise, forgetting for a moment to fan herself.
Imagine that, the niece of the great cartologer.
She was clearly impressed.
Tell me your name, dear. Sophia. Then tell me, Sophia, how is it that your famous uncle can't afford a better seat for you? Did he spend all his money on time? Oh, Shadrach can't afford time in Parliament,
Sophia said matter-of-factly.
Miles paid for it. 4 minutes and 13 seconds.
As Sophia spoke, the proceedings began. The 2 timekeepers on either side of the dais, stopwatches in their white-gloved hands, called for the first speaker, a Mr. Rupert Middles. The heavy-set man with an elaborate mustache made his way forward. He straightened his mustard-colored cravat, smoothed his mustache with fat fingers, and cleared his throat. Sophia's eyes widened as the timekeeper on the left set the clock to 27 minutes.
Look at that,
the plump woman whispered.
It must have cost him a fortune.
Sophia nodded. Her stomach tensed as Rupert Middles opened his mouth and his 27 minutes commenced.
I'm honored to appear before Parliament today,
he began thunderously.
This 14th of June of the year 1891 to propose a plan for the betterment of our beloved New Occident.
He took a deep breath.
The pirates in the United Indies, the hordes of raiders from the Badlands, the gradual encroachment of our territories from north, west, and south. How long will the New Occident go on ignoring the realities of our altered world, while the edges of our territory are eaten away by greedy mouths of foreigners?
There were boos and cheers from the crowd, but Middles hardly paused.
In the last year alone, 14 towns in New Akin were overrun by raiders from the Badlands, paying for none of the privileges that come with living in New Occident, but enjoying all of them to the full. During the same period, pirates seized 36 commercial ships with cargo from the United Indies. I need not remind you that only last week, the Gusty Nor'easter, a proud Boston vessel carried thousands of dollars in payment and merchandise, was seized by the notorious Bluebird, a despicable pirate who,
he added, his face red with exertion,
docks not a mile away in the Boston harbor.
Growls of angry encouragement surged from the crowd. Middles took a rapid breath and went on.
I am a tolerable man, like the people of Boston.
There were faint cheers. The cheers grew louder.
And I am loath to see the tolerance of my industry made a mockery by the greed of cunning outsiders.
Clapping and cheering erupted from the crowd.
I am here to propose a detailed plan, which I call the Patriot Plan, and which I am certain will be approved, as it represents the interests of those who, like me, believe in upholding our tolerance and our industry.
He braced himself against the dais.
Effective immediately, the borders must be closed.
He paused for the piercing cheers.
Citizens of New Occident may travel freely, if they have the proper documentation, to other ages. Foreigners living in New Occident who do not have citizenship will have several weeks to return to their ages of origin, and those remaining will be forcibly deported on June 4th of this year, the day which we celebrate the founding of this great nation.
More enthusiastic cries erupted, and a flurry of audience members stood to clap enthusiastically, continuing even as Middles charged ahead. Sophia felt her stomach sinking as Rupert Middles detailed the penalties for foreigners who remained in New Occident without documents and citizens who attempted to travel out of the country without permission. He spoke so quickly that she could see a line of foam gathering at the edge of his mustache and his forehead shining with sweat. Gesticulating wildly without bothering to wipe his brow, he spat across the dais as he enumerated the points of his plans, and the crowd around him cheered. Sophia had heard it all before, of course. Living as she did with the most famous cartographer in Boston, she had met all the great explorers who passed through this study and heard the much detested arguments championed by those who sought to bring the age of exploration to an end. But this did not make the vitriol of Rupert Middles any less appalling or his scheme any less terrible. As Sophia listened to the remaining minutes of the speech, she thought with growing anxiety of what closing the borders would mean. New Occident would lose its ties to the other ages. Beloved friends and neighbors would be forced to leave, but she, Sophia, would feel the loss even more acutely. They won't have the right documents. They won't get in, and I will lose them forever, she thought, her heart pounding. The woman sitting beside Sophia fanned herself and shook her head in disapproval. When the 27 minutes finally ran out and the timekeeper rang a loud bell, Middles staggered to his seat, sweating and panting, to wild applause that filled Sophia with dread. She could not imagine how Shadrach stood a chance of swaying an audience with only 4 minutes.
Dreadful spitter,
Sophia's companion put in with a distaste.
Mr. Augustus Wharton,
The first timekeeper called loudly while his colleague turned the clock to 15 minutes. The cheering and clapping subsided as a tall, white-haired man with a hooked nose strode confidently forward. He had no notes. He clasped the edge of the dais with long, white fingers.
You may begin,
The timekeeper said.
I appear before this assembly,
Mr. Wharton began in a deceptively low tone,
to commend the proposal put forth by Mr. Robert Middles, and persuade the 90 members of this Parliament that we should not only put it in place, but we should carry it farther,
he shouted, his voice rising to a crescendo. The audience on the Parliament floor clapped ecstatically. Sophia watched, agonized, as Shadrach's expression grew hard and furious.
Yes, we must close our borders, and yes, we must enact a swift deportation of foreigners who leech this great nation of its strength without giving it anything in return. But we must also close our borders to prevent the citizens of New Occident from leaving it and undermining our very foundation. I ask you, why should anyone wish to travel to the other ages, which we know to be inferior? Does not the true patriot stay home where he belongs? I have no doubt that our great explorers, of whom we are so proud, have only the best intentions in traveling to distant lands, pursuing the ecocentric knowledge which is unfortunately too lofty for many of us to comprehend.
With condescension as he inclined his head towards Shadrach and Miles. To Sophia's horror, Miles jumped to his feet. The crowd jeered as Shadrach rose quickly, placing a hand on his friend's arm and easing him back into his seat. Miles sat, fuming, while Wharton went on without acknowledging the interruption.
But surely these explorers are on occasion naive.
He continued, to loud calls of agreement.
Or perhaps we should say idealistic, when they do not realize that the very knowledge they so prize becomes the twisted tool of foreign powers bent on this great nation's destruction.
This was met with roars of approval.
Need I remind you of the great explorer Winston Hedges, whose knowledge of the Gulf Coast was ruthlessly exploited by pirates in the siege of New Orleans?
Loud boos indicated that the memory was indeed still fresh.
And it may not be lost on anyone,
he sneered,
that the masterful creations of a certain cartologer gracing us with his presence today make perfect research materials for any pirate, raider, or tyrannical ruler with an eye toward invasion.
The audience, taken aback by this direct attack, clapped somewhat reluctantly. Shadrach sat silently, his eyes furious but his face calm and grim. Sophia swallowed hard.
I'm sorry, dear,
the woman murmured.
That was very much uncalled for. In sum,
Wharton went on,
I wish to add an amendment that will be put in effect a complete closure of borders, not only for foreigners, but for citizens as well. Middles has the Patriot Plan, which will protect us from foreigners. I say good, but not good enough. I therefore propose here, in addition, a measure to protect us from ourselves. The Protection Amendment. Stay home, stay safe.
The cheers that met this were few but enthusiastic.
I propose that foreign relations be restricted and traded with specified ages be facilitated, respectfully, as follows.
Sophia hardly heard the remainder. She was watching Shadrach, wishing desperately that she could be sitting beside him rather than gazing down from the upper balcony, and she was thinking about what would happen if Wharton's plan past the age of exploration came to an end. Shadrach had warned her already that this might happen. He had done so again the night before, as he practiced his speech for the 15th time, standing at the kitchen table while Sophia made sandwiches. She had found it impossible to imagine that anyone would hold such a close-minded view. And yet it seemed, from the response of the people around her, that it was all too possible.
Does no one want the borders to remain open?
Sophia whispered at one point.
Of course they do, my dear,
the benchmate said placidly.
Most of us do, but we're not the ones who, with the money to talk in Parliament, are we? Did you notice that all the people who clap for the likes of them are on the ground floor in the privacy seats?
Sophia nodded forlornly. Finally, the bell rang and Wharton triumphantly left the stage. The timekeeper called.
Mr. Shadrach, Eli.
There was a smattering of polite clapping as Shadrach strode to the dais. While the clock was being set to 4 minutes and 13 seconds, he glanced up at the balcony and met Sophia's eye. He smiled, tapping the pocket of his jacket. Sophia smiled back.
What does that mean?
Her companion asked excitedly.
A secret sign. I wrote him a note for good luck.
The note was really a drawing, one of the many Shadrach and Sophia left for one another in unexpected places, an ongoing correspondence in images. It showed Clockwork Cora, the heroine they invented together, standing triumphantly before a cowed parliament. Clockwork Cora had a clock for a torso, a head full of curls, and rather spindly arms and legs. Fortunately, Shadrach was more dignified, with his dark hair swept back and his strong chin held high. He looked self-assured.
"You may begin,"
the timekeeper said.
"I am here today,"
Shadrach began quietly,
"not as a cartologer or an explorer, but as an inhabitant of our new world."
He paused, waiting 2 precious seconds so that his audience would listen carefully.
"There is a great poet,"
he said softly.
"There is a great poet, whom we are fortunate to know through his writing, an English poet born in the 16th century, before the disruption, whose verses every schoolchild learns, whose words have illuminated thousands of minds, but because he was born in the 16th century, and to the best of our knowledge, England now resides in the 12th age, he has not yet been born. Indeed, as the fates would have it, he may never be born at all. If he is not, then his surviving books will be all the more precious, and it will fall to us, to pass on his words, and make certain they do not disappear from this world. This great poet."
He paused, looking out into his audience, which had fallen silent.
"Wrote, no man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If Claude be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. I need not persuade you of his words. We have learned them to be true. We have seen, after the great disruption, the great impoverishment of our world as pieces fell away, washed into the seas of time. The Spanish Empire fragmented, the northern territories lost to prehistory, the whole of Europe plunged into a remote century, and many more pieces of our world lost to unknown ages. It was not so long ago, fewer than 100 years. We remember that loss still. My father's mother, Elizabeth Ellie, Lizzie, to those who knew her well, lived through the Great Disruption, and she saw that loss firsthand. Yet it was she who inspired me to become a cartologist by telling me the story of that fateful day and reminding me every time to think not of what we had lost, but what we might gain. It took us years, decades, to realize that this broken world could be mended, that we could reach remote ages and overcome the tremendous barriers of time and be the richer for it. We have perfected our technologies by borrowing from the learning of other ages. We have discovered new ways of understanding time. We have profited greatly by our trade and communication with nearby ages, and we have given. My good friend Arthur Wims at the Atlas Press,"
he said, holding up a slim leather-bound volume,
"has reprinted the writings of John Donne, so his words can be known to others beyond our age. And this learning across the ages is not at an end. Much of the New World is still unknown to us. Imagine what treasure, be it financial,"
he looked keenly at the members of Parliament,
"scientific or literary, lies beyond the borders of our age. Do you truly wish to wash that treasure away into the sea? Would you wish our own wisdom to fall out of this world, imprisoned within our borders? This cannot be, my friends, my fellow Bostonians. We are indeed tolerant, and we are industrious, as Mr. Middle claims. And we are part of the main. We are not an island. We must not behave like one."
The clock ran out of time just as Shadrach stepped away from the dais, and the timekeeper, caught up by the stirring words, somewhat belatedly rang his bell to still the silence of the State House. Sophia jumped to her feet, clapping loudly. The sound seemed to rouse the audience around her, which broke into applause as Shadrach returned to his seat. Miles pounded him heartily on the back. The other speakers sat stone-faced, but the cheers from the balcony made it clear that Shadrach had been heard.
"That was a good speech, wasn't it?"
Sophia asked.
"Marvelous,"
said the woman, clapping.
And by so handsome a speaker, my dear."
she added somewhat immaturely.
Simply stupendous. I only hope it's enough. 4 minutes isn't very much time, and time weighs more than gold. I know,
Sophia said, looking down at Shadrach, entirely unaware of the heat as the members of Parliament withdrew to their chamber to make a decision. She checked her watch, tugged it back into her pocket, and prepared herself to wait. 9:27. Parliament in chambers. The hall was stuffy with the smell of damp wool and peanuts, which the audience members brought from the vendors outside. Some people went out to get fresh air but quickly returned. No one wanted to be away when the members of Parliament returned and rendered their decision. There were 3 options. They could take no action at all, or recommend one of the plans for review, or adopt one of them for implementation. Sophia looked at the clock over the dais and realized that it was 10-hour, midday. As she checked to see if Shadrach had returned, she saw the members of Parliament filing into the hall.
They're coming back,
she said to her benchmate. Several minutes of rushed scurrying ensued as people tried to find their seats. Then a hush descended over the audience. The head of the Parliament walked into the dais, carrying a single sheet of paper. Sophia's stomach seemed to knot of its own accord. If they had voted for no action, as Shadrach recommended, they would not need a sheet of paper to say so. The man cleared his throat.
The members of Parliament,
he began slowly, emphasizing that he, for one, did not pay for his time,
have voted on the proposed measures. By a vote of 51 to 39, we have approved for immediate implementation,
he coughed,
to the Patriot Plan proposed by Rupert Middles.
The rest of his words were lost in an uproar. Sophia sat dazed, trying to comprehend what had happened. She pulled her satchel strap over her shoulder, then stood and peered over the balcony railing, anxious to find Shadrach, but he had been swallowed by the crowd. The audience behind her was expressing its collective disappointment by means of missiles. A crust of bread, a worn shoe, a half-eaten apple, a rainstorm of peanut shells hurled down at the members of Parliament. Sophia felt herself being pressed up against the lip of the balcony, and the enraged crowd pushed forward. For a terrible moment she clung to the wooden ledge to avoid being pushed over it.
Down to the chambers! Down to the chambers!
A timekeeper cried in a piercing tone. Sophia caught a glimpse of the members of Parliament hurrying past him.
Away so easily, cowards!
A man behind her shouted.
Follow them!
To her relief, the crowd suddenly pulled back and began clambering over the benches for the exits. Sophia looked around for the woman who had sat beside her, but she was gone. She took a moment in the thinning crowd, her heart still pounding, wondering what to do. Shadrach had said that he would meet her in the balcony, but now he would surely find it impossible. I promised to wait, Sophia said to herself firmly. She tried to steady her hands and ignore the shouts from below, which seemed to grow more violent by the second. A minute passed, then another. Sophia kept her eye on her watch so she would not lose track of time. Suddenly, she heard a distant murmur that became clearer as more people chanted in unison.
Smoke them out! Smoke them out! Smoke them out!
Sophia ran to the stairs. On the ground floor, a group of men was battering the doors of the Parliament chambers with the overturned dais.
Smoke them out!
A woman shrieked, feverishly piling chairs as if preparing for a bonfire. Sophia ran to the front doors, where seemingly the entire audience had congregated, choking off the entrance.
Smoke them out! Smoke them out! Smoke them out!
She hugged the satchel tightly against her chest and elbowed her way through.
You bigot!
A woman in front of her suddenly shouted, flailing her fists wildly at an older man in a gray suit. Sophia realized with shock that it was Augustus Wharton. As he swung out with his silver-tipped cane, 2 men with an unmistakable tattoos of the Indies threw themselves against him, one of them wrenching the cane from his hand and the other pulling his arms back behind him. The woman, her blue eyes fierce, her blonde hair clinging to her face, spat at Wharton. Suddenly, she crumpled into a pile of her own skirts, revealing a police officer behind her with his club still raised. The officer reached for Wharton protectively, and the 2 tattooed men melted away. There was a shout followed by a cascade of screams. Sophia smelled it before seeing it. Fire. The crowd parted, and she saw a torch being hurled toward the open doors of the State House. Screams burst out as the torch landed. She pushed her way into the crowd, trying vainly to catch a glimpse of Shadrach as she inched down the steps. The smell of smoke was sharp in her nostrils. As she neared the bottom, she heard a shrill voice cry out, "Filthy pirate!" An unshaven man with more than a few missing teeth suddenly toppled against her, knocking Sophia to the ground. He rose angrily and threw himself back against his assailant. Sophia pushed herself up from the hands and knees unsteadily. Seeing a clear path down the street, she hurried down the remaining steps, her knees trembling. There was a trolley stop right in front of the corner of the State House, and as Sophia ran toward it, a car was just arriving. Without stopping to check its destination, she jumped aboard.